Ilara's ragged breath tore at her throat, each gasp a desperate plea swallowed by the suffocating darkness of the Black Hills forest. Her legs, burning with an agony that mirrored the terror clawing at her insides, pumped relentlessly, carrying her deeper into the labyrinth of ancient pines. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of unseen leaves sent a fresh jolt of pure dread through her. She was pursued, not by a physical form she could discern in the gloom, but by an oppressive, unseen presence, a feeling of being hunted that was far more insidious than a tangible threat. The forest itself seemed to conspire against her, its shadowy depths offering no true refuge, only endless winding paths that promised eventual capture. Her only objective was escape, a frantic scramble for distance from an unknown horror. The cold night air stung her lungs, but the internal fire of her panic drove her onward, each stride a desperate gamble against the encroaching dread. Suddenly, a gnarled root reached out from the earth, tripping her with brutal force. She tumbled, a cry catching in her throat as she hit the damp soil, scraping knees and palms. Scrambling instinctively, she burrowed beneath the thick protective canopy of intertwined roots, pressing herself against the cold, unyielding earth. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat in the deafening silence that followed her fall. She forced herself to remain still, every muscle screaming for movement, but fear held her captive, rigid. The sounds of her own labored breathing seemed to echo impossibly loud in the stillness, each exhale a potential betrayer. The scent of pine and damp earth filled her nostrils, a stark contrast to the burning adrenaline that coursed through her veins. She squeezed her eyes shut, desperately willing herself to become invisible, to simply cease to exist. Flickers of memory, sharp and unwelcome, pierced through her present terror. A heavy, leather-bound ledger, its pages yellowed with age, appeared in her mind's eye. She saw a slender, elegant hand, familiar yet unnerving, poised with a quill over a meticulously inscribed name. Then with a chilling precision, a dark line bisected the name, erasing it from the record. A silent declaration of absence. Her own voice, a frantic whisper from a recent past, echoed in her thoughts. The fifth, always the fifth. Those words, born of a dawning, unspeakable realization, now haunted her with an even greater urgency. The images, fragmented and fleeting, served as grim reminders of the insidious pattern that had led her to this desperate flight, a macabre counting that culminated in silent, irreversible deletions. The quiet resolve of that crossed-out name, the chilling implication of its repeated erasure, propelled her back into the agonizing reality of her immediate danger. These weren't mere recollections, they were visceral warnings, proof of the sinister game being played, a game in which she had unwillingly become a player. Her mind raced, connecting the fragments, piecing together the grim tableau that had forced her into the frigid, unforgiving embrace of the Black Hills. The face of the woman wielding the quill remained elusive, obscured by the haze of terror and memory. But the cold finality of the act itself was burned into Ilara's consciousness. It was a silent judgment, a predetermined outcome for the unlucky few, and now for her. The weight of this realization pressed down on her even as she lay hidden. Then, a faint, almost melodic chime drifted through the dense trees. It was the soft, distinctive ring of a small bell, a sound she recognized with a jolt of both despair and perverse hope. It was the bell from the boarding house, the whispering pines, the very place she had fled in a desperate, breathless scramble for survival. Driven by an instinct she couldn't rationalize, a magnetic pull she couldn't resist, she cautiously moved, pushing through the undergrowth. Ahead, barely visible through the thick canopy, a faint, flickering light beckoned, a beacon in the oppressive darkness. It was a window, its glow a deceptive warmth against the chilling reality that it emanated from the very structure she had risked everything to escape. The irony was a cruel twist of fate. A wave of profound, soul-crushing despair washed over Ilara. Despite her frantic, heart-pounding flight, despite every ounce of effort and terror, she had been led back inexorably to the genesis of her nightmare. The realization settled in her gut like a cold, heavy stone. She was trapped. The danger she had sought to outrun was not external, but an inescapable part of her immediate world. The Black Hills had become a cage, and the boarding house, with its deceptive warmth and its insidious secrets, was its focal point. The finality of her situation, the chilling certainty that there was no escaping the predetermined path, was more terrifying than any monster she could imagine. The flickering light of the window, once a symbol of vague hope, now glowed with an ominous magnetic pull, sealing her fate. 2 months prior to her desperate flight through the shadowed Black Hills, Ilara arrived in the bustling yet somewhat raw frontier town nestled amidst the formidable peaks. A skilled seamstress, she carried little more than a small worn satchel, her thimble, and an unyielding determination to forge a new life. Her journey had been long and arduous, a quiet escape from an unspecified, difficult past that she rarely spoke of, even to herself. The promise of the Black Hills, a magnet for fortune seekers and dreamers, offered not just work, but the anonymity and fresh start she craved. The air, crisp and carrying the scent of pine and distant campfires, felt invigorating, a stark contrast to the stifling circumstances she had left behind. She walked with a quiet resilience, her gaze fixed on the horizon, hoping that this untamed land would finally offer her a semblance of peace and stability. After days of searching for suitable lodging and work, Ilara stumbled upon the Whispering Pines, a boarding house set slightly apart from the main thoroughfare of the burgeoning town. Its name evoked a sense of tranquility, and its exterior, with neatly painted shutters and a welcoming porch swing, indeed promised respite. Compared to the rough-and-tumble inns closer to the mines, this establishment exuded an air of genteel calm, a seemingly safe haven in a wild landscape. However, even on her initial approach, a subtle undercurrent of excessive order struck Ilara. The garden was almost unnaturally manicured. The silence within its walls, even during the busiest hours of the day, was profound. It was inviting, yes, but carried with it an unspoken expectation of decorum that bordered on the austere. Stepping across the threshold, Ilara was greeted by Mrs. Albright, the proprietress. She was a woman of impeccable presentation, her dark hair neatly pinned, her dress modest yet tailored, with a precision that spoke of careful attention to detail. Mrs. Albright's smile was polite, almost practiced, a cordial mask that never quite reached her eyes. Those eyes, Ilara noticed, were a piercing shade, observant and deep, holding a quiet intensity that was difficult to meet directly. They seemed to take in everything, missing nothing, yet revealing little of the woman's inner thoughts. Her voice was soft, her movements graceful, embodying the very essence of a refined, albeit somewhat formidable matriarch presiding over her domain. Mrs. Albright's demeanor, while outwardly welcoming, held an enigmatic quality that Ilara couldn't quite place. There was a politeness that felt almost too perfect, a composure that never faltered, even when dealing with the boisterous garimperos who sometimes passed through. Ilara sensed a steeliness beneath the genteel exterior, a quiet authority that commanded respect without ever needing to raise her voice. It was less a warmth that embraced and more a polished surface that reflected, keeping her true self carefully guarded. This initial impression lingered with Ilara, a subtle discord in the otherwise harmonious atmosphere of the Whispering Pines, planting a tiny seed of quiet curiosity about the woman who so meticulously ran the establishment. The boarding house hosted a small, fluctuating group of guests, primarily rough-hewn prospectors and garimperos drawn to the lure of gold, interspersed with a few transient travelers pausing on their journeys through the territory. They were a diverse lot, Some were boisterous and eager to share tales of their latest finds or near misses. Others were more solitary, nursing their hopes and failures in quiet contemplation. Ilara, with her quiet observations, noted the ebb and flow of their interactions, the brief alliances and the unspoken rivalries. She found some to be genuinely friendly, offering a kind word or a shared meal, while others remained stubbornly reserved, their faces etched with the hardships and dreams of frontier life, wary of newcomers and keeping their own counsel. Ilara, settling into her new routine, began to observe the finer points of Mrs. Albright's management. The matron's dedication to order bordered on the obsessive. Every cushion was fluffed, every surface dusted, every meal served with precise timing. Nothing seemed out of place, ever. This meticulousness, while admirable, also created an environment of almost sterile perfection, a lack of the usual untidiness that characterized most frontier lodgings. This unwavering attention to detail extended to the guests. Mrs. Albright maintained a discreet, almost imperceptible vigilance over everyone, always seeming to know who was where and what they were doing without ever appearing intrusive or overbearing, a silent shadow ensuring everything ran smoothly. However, it was Mrs. Albright's particular reverence for a large, heavy, leather-bound book that truly caught Ilara's attention. The book, an antique ledger with yellowed pages, rested on a polished wooden stand at the reception desk, almost like a sacred artifact. Mrs. Albright handled it with an unusual solemnity, often poring over its contents with a focused intensity that transcended mere administrative duty. She would consult it frequently, her brow furrowed in concentration, her movements deliberate and careful. Ilara noticed that the matron often kept the book open, a silent, ever-present fixture in the main hall, its presence a constant, understated focal point of the boarding house's meticulous operations, hinting at its profound importance to Mrs. Albright. This ledger, old and seemingly innocuous, held a peculiar sway over Mrs. Albright. It wasn't just a record of arrivals and departures. It seemed to be a repository of something far more significant to her. Ilara often saw her tracing lines of text with a gloved finger, her lips moving almost imperceptibly as if in quiet contemplation or calculation. The way Mrs. Albright's gaze lingered on certain entries, her expression momentarily clouding with an emotion Ilara couldn't quite discern, suggested a deeper connection to the book's contents than simple bookkeeping. It became clear that for Mrs. Albright this ledger was more than just an accounting tool. It was an integral, almost ritualistic part of her daily existence at the Whispering Pines. As the days turned into weeks at the Whispering Pines, Ilara, though preoccupied with her own work, began to notice a subtle yet unsettling trend among the other guests. It started subtly, almost imperceptibly, with a prospector or a traveling merchant who had been staying for several days, simply no longer appearing at the breakfast table. Their belongings, she assumed, would be quietly removed, and their absence attributed to a sudden change of plans or a new opportunity. In the transient world of the Black Hills, such abrupt departures were not uncommon. Fortune seekers often arrived and vanished with equal speed, following rumors of strikes or abandoning futile hopes. Ilara initially rationalized these disappearances, telling herself it was merely the ebb and flow of frontier life, a natural part of the ceaseless movement in a land built on impermanence. She tried to dismiss the fleeting unease. Yet as more guests arrived and in turn silently departed, a nagging feeling began to solidify into something more concrete. There was a lack of farewells, an absence of the usual boisterous goodbyes or even polite nods that typically accompanied a departure. It was as if these individuals simply ceased to exist within the walls of the Whispering Pines. Their absence was too clean, too quiet. Ilara, sensitive to nuances and patterns, found herself unconsciously tracking these comings and goings, a growing sense of disquiet stirring beneath her calm exterior. The initial rationalizations began to wear thin, replaced by a nascent, unarticulated question about the sudden, complete silence that followed certain guest stays, a silence that felt heavier than mere absence. Her burgeoning unease naturally gravitated towards the heavy, leather-bound ledger that remained a constant presence on the reception desk. Mrs. Albright's peculiar reverence for the book had already caught Ilara's attention, but now her curiosity deepened, tinged with a growing apprehension. She found her gaze drawn to it whenever she passed by, observing Mrs. Albright's frequent consultations. The matron's expression, usually a polite mask, would deepen into a serious, almost somber concentration whenever she was bent over its pages. It was more than a mere record. It seemed to be a repository of secrets, a silent chronicle that held the answers to the unsettling patterns Ilara had begun to discern. The book, previously a mere curiosity, transformed into a focal point for her growing suspicion. One particularly quiet evening, with only the distant howl of a coyote breaking the stillness, Ilara observed Mrs. Albright from the shadowed archway of the dining room. The matron, as was her custom, sat at the reception desk, the lamplight casting long shadows across her face as she meticulously perused the ledger. With a deliberate, almost ritualistic movement, she dipped a quill into an inkwell. Ilara watched, mesmerized by the matron's focused intensity as the quill moved, not to add a new entry, but to strike a line through an existing name. The stroke was precise, final, an act of definitive erasure. A profound chill, cold and sharp, snaked its way down Ilara's spine. It was a moment of terrifying clarity, connecting the quiet departures with this silent, symbolic act of deletion. The finality of that crossed-out name sent a shiver through Ilara, igniting a desperate need for understanding. Her mind raced, replaying the sequence of guests and their abrupt disappearances. She knew instinctively that the act she had just witnessed was tied to those unexplained departures. The ledger was not merely tracking arrivals and stays, it was tracking something far more sinister. Fear battled with a morbid fascination. She began cautiously to pay even closer attention, trying to commit to memory the names of current guests and the sequence in which they had arrived. Every time Mrs. Albright consulted the book, Ilara's eyes would dart towards it, trying to catch another glimpse, to decipher the cryptic ritual she suspected was unfolding within its ancient pages. Her meticulous, though surreptitious observations slowly began to yield a terrifying insight. She realized that the names Mrs. Albright crossed out were not random. There was a chilling mathematical precision to it. Ilara started counting. After a guest arrived, Mrs. Albright would wait for a certain number of new entries or a certain passage of time. Then, another name would be struck. With growing dread, Ilara began to piece together the consistency. Always, without fail, it was the fifth name from the last one that had been erased. The pattern was unmistakable, a horrifying revelation. The fifth guest to arrive after a previous deletion would simply vanish, their name then summarily crossed out in the ledger. This numerical pattern, once identified, transformed Ilara's growing apprehension into a tangible, suffocating fear. The realization solidified in her mind. The disappearances were not random acts of frontier life, but part of a deliberate, terrifying ritual orchestrated by the seemingly composed Mrs. Albright. The ledger was not merely a record, it was a death list, or something akin to it, maintained with chilling diligence. A sinister logic had emerged from the polite facade of the Whispering Pines. Ilara's world, which she had hoped would offer her a fresh start, now felt like a meticulously crafted trap, its true nature slowly, horrifyingly, unveiling itself through the quiet, consistent strokes of a matron's pen. The pattern was a whispered threat, and Ilara, with a growing sense of dread, began to wonder who would be next. The chilling discovery of the fifth name pattern had opened Ilara's ears to a new kind of sound in the Whispering Pines. What she had previously dismissed as background noise, the low murmurs from the common room, the hushed conversations by the fireplace, now held sinister significance. She found herself subconsciously straining to catch snippets, piecing together fragments of whispers exchanged between the older, more superstitious prospectors. Their voices, often lowered to conspiratorial tones, spoke of bad luck that seemed to cling to the boarding house, a peculiar misfortune that wasn't just about failed gold strikes. They alluded to folks who just couldn't settle right in the Black Hills, people who arrived with high hopes only to fade away, their trails growing cold. These hushed exchanges painted a disquieting picture, weaving a narrative that transcended mere coincidence. The discussions often circled back to an unsettling energy or presence in the region, something ancient and primal that demanded respect, or perhaps tribute. Ilara heard phrases like, "The land claims its own," and "the hills have eyes," spoken with a fearful reverence that unsettled her deeply. The casual dismissal she once held for such frontier superstitions now crumbled under the weight of her own chilling observations regarding Mrs. Albright's ledger. The vague dread she felt earlier was now crystallizing, fed by these whispered anecdotes that seemed to validate her darkest suspicions about the boarding house's true nature. Among these storytellers was an old prospector named Silas, his face weathered by years of sun and hardship, his eyes holding a haunted glint. One evening, emboldened by a dram of whiskey, he recounted a local legend specifically tied to the Whispering Pines, or perhaps more broadly, to the very patch of land it stood upon. His voice dropped to a gravelly whisper as he spoke of an ancient pact, an unspoken agreement between the early settlers and something primal and hungry in the earth itself. The land, he claimed, demanded a price, a constant offering to maintain a delicate balance between its bounty and its darker aspects. To neglect this price, Silas warned, was to invite ruin, not just upon oneself, but upon the entire community. Silas's tale wove a narrative of mysterious disappearances that stretched back decades, long before Mrs. Albright, or even her parents, had owned the boarding house. He spoke of sacrifices made to appease an ancient, dormant force, a practice carried out by caretakers who understood the unspoken rules of the land. These weren't acts of malice, he emphasized, but of necessity, a dark duty passed down through generations. The specificity of his lore, aligning eerily with the numerical pattern Ilara had uncovered, sent a fresh wave of terror through her. The legend, once a campfire tale, now resonated with horrifying truth, suggesting a grim purpose behind the matron's precise, chilling deletions from the ledger. As the days passed, the ominous patterns and whispered legends began to invade Ilara's sleep. Her nights became a torment of vivid, disturbing nightmares. The heavy, leather-bound ledger from the reception desk would feature prominently, its pages turning seemingly on their own, the names within blurring and reforming in an endless, horrifying loop. In these dreams, a disembodied voice, indistinct yet undeniably female, would echo through the dark corridors of her subconscious, repeating a single, chilling word: 5. The word would be intoned with an insistent, almost hypnotic rhythm, each repetition tightening the knot of fear in her chest, a relentless countdown to an unknown, dreadful event. The dreams were relentless, a relentless assault on her sanity. She would wake in a cold sweat, the word 5 still buzzing in her ears, the image of the ledger burned behind her eyelids. The line between waking and sleeping began to blur, and the oppressive atmosphere of the Whispering Pines intensified. The boarding house, once a perceived refuge, now felt less like a home and more like an entity, a living, breathing trap that watched her every move. Every creak of the floorboards, every shadow cast by the dim lamplight seemed imbued with a sinister awareness. She felt an unbearable sense of being constantly observed, as if invisible eyes were tracking her, making her a permanent fixture in a silent, terrifying play. The once comforting silence of the pension, previously a welcome change from the clamor of the outside world, now became a source of profound dread. It was a silence that felt heavy, pregnant with unspoken threats, a stillness that suggested a watchful, patient predator. Ilara's every movement felt calculated, every sound she made seemed to echo too loudly in the unnerving quiet. The whispered fragments of conversations, the ancient legends, and her own haunting dreams coalesced into a suffocating certainty. The Whispering Pines was not merely a place of lodging, but a participant in a dark ritual, a willing accomplice to the systematic disappearance of its guests. And with the memory of the crossed-out names and the relentless whisper of 5, Ilara knew with chilling clarity that her own fate might already be sealed within its pages. The escalating dread, fueled by whispers and nightmares, finally reached a breaking point within Ilara. She could no longer bear the suffocating weight of uncertainty, the gnawing question of whether her terrifying suspicions were rooted in truth or simply a product of an overactive imagination. The need for definitive confirmation, for undeniable proof of the sinister pattern she believed was unfolding, became an overwhelming imperative, eclipsing her fear of being discovered. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the unsettling quiet of the boarding house. She knew the risk was immense, but the alternative, living under the shadow of a silent, impending doom, was far more unbearable. The time for passive observation was over. She had to act. A fleeting opportunity presented itself one afternoon. Mrs. Albright, after instructing Ilara on a sewing task, announced she would be out briefly to acquire supplies from the town. As the front door clicked shut and the sound of the matron's footsteps faded down the path, a surge of adrenaline coursed through Ilara. This was her chance, perhaps the only one she would get. Every nerve ending tingled with a mixture of fear and urgent determination. Her hands, usually steady and precise with needle and thread, trembled visibly as she slowly made her way towards the reception desk. The heavy ledger, usually under the watchful eye of Mrs. Albright, now sat unattended, an open invitation to confront her deepest fears. Approaching the desk felt like stepping into a lion's den. The polished wood gleamed innocently under the filtered light, but the ledger itself seemed to radiate a cold, malevolent energy. Ilara hesitated for a breath, her gaze darting to the closed parlor door, listening intently for any sound of movement within the seemingly empty house. The silence was profound, broken only by the frantic beat of her own heart. With utmost caution, she reached out, her fingers brushing against the ancient leather cover. The sensation was chilling, as if she were touching something forbidden, something imbued with unspeakable secrets. Her hands still trembled, but a grim resolve had taken root. Slowly, meticulously, Ilara began to turn the brittle, yellowed pages of the ledger. Each sheet was filled with elegant, precise script, names of guests meticulously recorded. Her memory, sharpened by terror, recalled the faces and stories of those who had quietly vanished. She compared the names she remembered with the entries on the page, and there it was, stark and undeniable, a series of dark, decisive lines scoring through various names. Each stroke was a cold, irrefutable confirmation of her worst fears. There was no room for doubt, no rational explanation left. The departures were not random, nor were they voluntary. They were acts of erasure, systematically executed. With each turn of the page, the horrifying pattern solidified. She counted back from each crossed-out name, and consistently, chillingly, the preceding 4 names were untouched, followed by another deletion. The 1 in 5 rule was real, a meticulously adhered to ritual, stretching back through the years documented in the ledger. It wasn't a coincidence, or a trick of her mind. It was a terrifying, unwavering truth laid bare before her. Each precise line through a name represented a life that had ceased to exist within the confines of the boarding house, an individual who had become part of Mrs. Albright's silent, macabre tally. The cold, hard evidence was undeniable. stripping away any last vestige of rational hope. Then her eyes fell upon the current sequence of names, those guests presently residing in the Whispering Pines, awaiting their fate. Her breath hitched in her throat, a choked gasp that was swallowed by the heavy silence of the room. With trembling fingers, she began to count, starting from the last name that had been crossed out. 1, 2, 3, 4, and there, staring up at her from the page, the fifth name in the sequence was undeniably her own, Ilara. A sudden, icy dread paralyzed her, solidifying into a terrifying personal certainty. The pattern wasn't just a grim observation, it was a direct, inescapable threat to her own existence. The realization hit her with the force of a physical blow. The abstract terror she had felt, the growing suspicion of a hidden danger, now coalesced into a horrifying personal truth. She wasn't just an observer of the macabre ritual, she was its next designated victim. Her name, inscribed in Mrs. Albright's elegant hand, was already entered into the ledger, awaiting the fatal stroke of the quill. The world seemed to tilt on its axis, and the once quaint boarding house transformed into a predatory maw, its walls closing in around her. The mere suspicion had given way to an undeniable, terrifying certainty, sealing her fate within the pages of that ancient, sinister book. The terrifying revelation of her name being the next fifth on the ledger propelled Ilara into a blinding, desperate panic. The neatly ordered boarding house, once a facade of domestic tranquility, now felt like an elaborate, inescapable cage. She bolted from the reception desk, her mind screaming for an escape, for any way out. Her initial instinct led her to the front door, but the heavy oak, which usually opened with a gentle creak, was now unyielding. She fumbled with the latch, her fingers clumsy with fear, only to discover an array of unusual, intricate bolts and mechanisms she'd never noticed before, securing it from the inside. Each window, even those that seemed easily accessible from a casual glance, was similarly sealed, either nailed shut with surprising strength or fitted with latches that defied her frantic attempts to open them. It was as if the very structure of the Whispering Pines was conspiring silently and deliberately to hold her captive within its sinister embrace. Frantic, Ilara raced through the quiet corridors, her heart hammering against her ribs, searching for any weakness in the boarding house's seemingly impenetrable defenses. Every door, every window became a new source of crushing despair, each one locked or sealed with an unsettling permanence. The silence of the house, usually peaceful, now felt predatory, amplifying her own ragged breaths and the frantic thud of her footsteps. It was during this desperate search that Mrs. Albright materialized. She simply appeared at the end of a long hallway, her presence sudden and unnervingly quiet, as if she had always been there, waiting. There was no sound of footsteps, no rustle of fabric, just her sudden, composed appearance. Ilara froze, her breath catching in her throat, every fiber of her being screaming in silent terror. Mrs. Albright's face remained a mask of polite, distant cordiality. The same unsettling, almost practiced smile played on her lips, but her eyes, usually observant, were now fixed on Ilara with an unnerving intensity, devoid of any warmth or human emotion. There was no anger, no overt threat, only an unnerving, profound calmness that was far more terrifying than any outburst of rage. It was the calm of inevitability, of absolute control. The air in the corridor grew heavy, thick with an unspoken understanding between the two women. No words were exchanged, no accusations hurled, no pleas uttered. Just the dense, oppressive silence, permeated by a palpable tension that hummed between them, more chilling than any scream. Ilara understood. Mrs. Albright knew, driven by a surge of primal fear and a desperate will to survive, Ilara found an improbable avenue of escape. Deep in the seldom-used cellar, obscured by cobwebs and forgotten barrels, lay a small, rusty window, almost entirely overgrown with ivy. It was old, poorly maintained, and seemed to have been overlooked in the boarding house's meticulous ceiling. With a surge of renewed strength, Ilara attacked it, pushing and kicking with all her might. The brittle wood finally groaned, then splintered, and the rusty hinges shrieked as the window gave way under her relentless assault. She squeezed through the narrow opening, tearing her dress and scraping her skin, tumbling out into the welcome, albeit terrifying, darkness of the Black Hills forest. Freedom, however precarious, was finally within her grasp. The escape into the forest was not a moment of liberation, but merely the transition to a different kind of nightmare. Ilara ran blindly, the dense trees and uneven terrain becoming a disorienting labyrinth. There was no direct physical pursuit. Mrs. Albright was not chasing her through the woods, yet her presence was acutely felt in every rustle of leaves, every creak of branches, every shadow that stretched and danced in the moonlight. The forest itself seemed to become an extension of the matron's will, twisting and turning, disorienting Ilara with illusions of familiar paths that led nowhere. It was a psychological chase, a relentless, pervasive sense of being enmeshed, of being expertly herded back towards an inevitable conclusion, reinforcing the terrifying realization that she was still very much trapped, merely in a larger, darker enclosure. Despite her desperate headlong flight through the treacherous darkness of the Black Hills, Ilara found herself inexplicably drawn back towards the very source of her terror, the whispering pines. Dew! The flickering glow from a window, a distant rhythmic tolling of a bell, the same bell she had heard in her initial escape, acted as a hypnotic beacon in the oppressive night. Her mind screamed for her to run in the opposite direction, to seek true refuge. But a strange, compelling force seemed to guide her weary, trembling legs back along the winding forest paths. It was as if the boarding house, or whatever ancient power resided within it, exerted a magnetic pull that she was powerless to resist. She was not merely returning, she was being drawn back, an unwilling moth to a deadly flame, unable to completely break free from its sinister orbit. Back within the chilling confines of the boarding house, perhaps in a state of exhaustion-induced delirium, a final, desperate instinct led Ilara to a hidden space. Perhaps a loose floorboard in the attic, a false panel behind a forgotten painting, or a concealed compartment beneath a rickety staircase. There, tucked away from prying eyes, she unearthed a trove of secrets, an ancient, leather-bound diary, its pages brittle with age, likely belonging to Mrs. Albright or an even earlier proprietress of the Whispering Pines. Alongside it lay a collection of small personal effects, a faded locket, a carved wooden pipe, a worn handkerchief, unmistakably belonging to the very guests whose names had been so chillingly erased from the ledger. These were not mere forgotten trinkets. They were grim mementos, silent testaments to lives abruptly ended within these walls. The diary, when Ilara finally opened its fragile pages, did not reveal the ramblings of a sadistic killer, but rather the deeply disturbing justifications of a zealot. It chronicled not malice, but a twisted, inherited sense of duty. The entries spoke of an ancient pact, a generations-old understanding between the keepers of the Whispering Pines and the formidable unseen forces of the Black Hills. Mrs. Albright, or her predecessor, believed herself to be the unwilling guardian of a sacred, albeit horrifying, tradition, a mystical necessity to feed the land, to appease something primal and demanding that resided beneath the surface. The price of one in every 5 guests was not an act of cruelty, but a chillingly rationalized offering, deemed essential to ensure the continued safety and prosperity of the boarding house, its inhabitants, and perhaps even the wider community. It was a terrifying duty, a burden passed down through a lineage of silent compliance. Armed with this horrifying yet strangely coherent understanding of Mrs. Albright's motives, Ilara faced a desperate, defining choice: The knowledge she now possessed was a double-edged sword. She could attempt to expose Mrs. Albright, to reveal the unspeakable ritual to the authorities or the townsfolk. However, in an isolated frontier town steeped in superstition, the chances of her being believed over a respected, if enigmatic, matron were slim. More likely, she would be dismissed as hysterical, perhaps even imprisoned. Or she could use this newfound understanding not to expose, but to find a way to finally sever the ancient insidious cycle, to somehow break the binding pact that demanded such a terrible toll. This was her moment of agency, her chance to transcend victimhood and perhaps to truly escape. The outcome of Ilara's choice remains shrouded in ambiguity, leaving a lingering, unsettling question. Perhaps she managed a definitive escape, slipping away with the diary as tangible proof, potentially alerting distant authorities or finding someone who would believe her harrowing tale, thus finally bringing the dark cycle of the Whispering Pines to an end. Or in a more chilling alternative, the final scene might depict Mrs. Albright, serene and composed, calmly turning a new page in the ancient ledger. Her quill would hover over the next pristine line, awaiting the inscription of a new fifth name, implying that the ancient pact or the matron's unwavering belief in it remains unbroken, a perpetual shadow over the Black Hills. Yet even in this darker ending, Ilara's name might be notably absent from the current entries, a testament to her survival, a fragile beacon of defiance against the endless dread.